Stop what you're doing for just a moment. Not because I'm going to tell you something motivational, not because I have a three-step formula that's going to change your life by Thursday. Stop because there's a question sitting underneath everything you've been doing today, every decision you've made this week, every relationship you've been navigating, every financial worry you've been carrying around like a stone in your pocket, and almost nobody ever thinks to ask it out loud. Here it is. What are you actually building right now? Not with your hands, not with your job or your savings account or your gym routine, with your thoughts, with the specific, repeated, mostly unexamined stream of thought that has been running through your mind since the moment you opened your eyes this morning. Because here's the thing, and I need you to really sit with this before we go any further. There is a book. It was written almost 140 years ago by a man named Prentice Mulford, and it has quietly outlasted nearly every other self-help idea that was popular in its own era. It predates the term law of attraction by more than a century. It predates the modern wellness industry, the mindset coaching world, the entire genre of personal development content you and I both consume. And yet, the core argument Mulford makes in those pages is now being circled back to by neuroscientists, by researchers in psychoneuroimmunology, by people in laboratories studying how belief alone, measurably, physically, changes outcomes in the body and in life. He didn't write it from a university. He didn't arrive at it in a lab. He arrived at it watching ordinary people live ordinary lives and noticing a pattern so consistent it refused to be explained away. The pattern was this. The people who thought certain things with enough repetition and enough consistency eventually, reliably, lived those things. Not metaphorically, not as a feel-good approximation of truth. As a fact, uncomfortable and non-negotiable, that applied whether you believed in it or not. And that pattern, that old uncomfortable fact, is exactly what this is about. Because you are not outside of it. You never were. And the moment you genuinely understand what's been happening underneath the surface of your daily life, everything looks different. So let's go there together. Chapter 1. Your thought is not a shadow. Let's start with the claim that changes everything, the one Mulford makes on the very first page of his work, the one that sounds almost too simple to take seriously until you actually sit with it long enough to feel its weight. Your thought is a thing, not a symbol of a thing, not a representation of something real, not a harmless private event that flickers through your mind like a passing cloud and disappears without consequence. A thing, as real and as substantial and as active in the world as anything you can touch or measure or see. I know how that sounds. I know that the word thing, applied to thought, feels like a stretch, maybe even a little mystical. But stay with me here, because Mulford's argument is not mystical. It is mechanical, and the mechanics are worth understanding in full before you make up your mind about whether any of it applies to you. Here is the observation that started everything for him. He spent time among people who worked in genuinely dangerous environments. People who dealt every single day with the plain, physical, unforgiving reality of risk. Miners who descended underground every morning with no guarantee of coming back up. Sailors who read the weather through years of hard-won experience and still couldn't always predict what the sea would do next. People, in other words, who had no patience for anything they couldn't see or feel or rely on practically. And among those people, watching them over time, Mulford noticed something that no tidy explanation of coincidence could fully account for. The person who talked about the accident, who spoke of it at the start of each shift, and again halfway through, and again at the end, who warned others about it, who carried it in their voice and their body language, who seemed almost unable to stop rehearsing the disaster in their own mind before it had happened. That person was, with a regularity that should genuinely trouble you, the person to whom the accident came. Not always on the exact day they predicted, but it came. And meanwhile, the person working in the same conditions, breathing the same air, navigating the same risks, but thinking steadily about the job and not about catastrophe, walked out again at the end of the shift, as they had done every shift before. The obvious response here is carelessness. The fearful person must be less careful, more distracted, more prone to the mistakes that cause accidents. But Mulford specifically addresses this. The fearful person was often, he noticed, the more careful of the two, more cautious, more deliberate, more anxious in their attention to every detail of what they were doing. More careful and more doomed, not because care is useless, but because the thought being held, the thing being built minute by minute in the mind, was being built out of material that fear had supplied. And a structure built from fear has a particular shape, one that tends to find the outcomes fear imagines. Now, I want to be honest with you here because Mulford was honest in his book, and anything less than that would be a disservice. This cannot be proven the way a chemistry experiment is proven. You cannot isolate the fearful thought in a controlled environment and measure exactly how many units of bad outcome it produces per hour. The instruments we have still aren't fine enough for that, though neuroscience is getting closer every year. But here's the thing about that objection, and it's worth hearing all the way through. 150 years ago, nobody could show you electricity either. It was there, running through everything, waiting for instruments fine enough to catch it. A failure to measure a force is not proof that the force doesn't exist. It is only a reason to watch its effects more carefully. And the effects, once you start truly watching for them, are genuinely not hard to find. Think about the people you know, not in the abstract, in the specific. Think about the person in your life who talks most consistently about their bad luck, who tells you every time you see them about the latest thing that went wrong, who seems to wear misfortune as a kind of identity, almost proud of how reliably the world disappoints them. Now think about how often new misfortunes actually arrive for that person, compared to others in similar circumstances. Think about the person who has cataloged their health problems for years, who begins every conversation with what their body is doing wrong this week, who describes their constitution as fundamentally fragile, their immune system as chronically unreliable, their energy as always just slightly less than what the day requires. Now think about whether that person's health is, on the whole, improving or declining, and whether the decline seems to move faster than the decline of people who talk about their bodies differently. We call these patterns bad luck. We excuse ourselves from looking further because looking further leads somewhere uncomfortable. But Mulford looked further, and what he found is the whole reason we're here. You are building something right now, not in the future, not someday when you get around to thinking more carefully about what you want. Right now, as you read this, your thought is laying material down, the way a bricklayer lays material down without stopping to consider whether the wall they're building is actually the wall they want to live inside. The question Mulford forces us to sit with, the one that becomes impossible to shake once you've genuinely considered it, is not whether you're building. You are. That part was never in question. The question is what you've been building without realizing your hand was on the trowel. Chapter 2. The body hears everything you think. There is a belief so embedded in the way most of us think about ourselves that it rarely gets questioned directly. It's so familiar it feels like plain fact rather than assumption. And it goes something like this. The body is what it is. It was handed to you through genetics, shaped by circumstance, and subject to forces largely outside your control. Your mind lives inside it, observes it, works with what it's given, but doesn't fundamentally author it. That belief is the one this chapter is here to dismantle, gently, but completely, because your body is not a fixed inheritance you're riding around in. It is not a machine that came assembled and runs independently of what you think. It is, and this is the part that changes everything once you really absorb it, closer to a construction project that never stops, one that tears itself down and rebuilds itself continuously day after day at the cellular level, taking instruction from a source most people never think to examine. That source is thought, not occasionally, not in dramatic moments of crisis or transformation, constantly, every hour, every day, whether the instruction is being given consciously or whether it's being given by default, by the habitual, unexamined stream of thought that runs beneath the visible surface of your life. Let me give you a picture of what this actually looks like in practice, because abstract claims without grounding don't serve anyone. Imagine two people, same age, same general health history. They live in the same city, work similar hours, eat similarly. One of them starts every morning by standing in front of the bathroom mirror and conducting what can only be described as a damage assessment. Every new line, every change, every sign of something that might be declining. It's not vanity. It's closer to dread, a daily inventory of what's going wrong, held with a quiet certainty that the downward trend is real, inevitable, and accelerating. The other person gives their reflection approximately 30 seconds of attention before their brain moves to the day ahead. Not because they're naive or in denial, but because their habitual thought doesn't live there. It lives in what they're going to do, who they're going to talk to, what they're working on. Strangers, meeting both of these people, consistently guess the first person to be older than they are and the second person to be younger. Neither of them has done anything cosmetically different. One of them has done something profoundly different at the level of thought. And the body has followed the thought's instruction with a faithfulness that, once you notice it, is impossible to unsee. This isn't poetry. This is mechanics. Every organ in your body is fed by blood. Blood is governed by the nervous system, and the nervous system responds to nothing as quickly, as completely, or as persistently as it responds to thought. You already know this in its dramatic form. You know what happens to your body when you're genuinely afraid. Your throat tightens. Your hands get cold. Your muscles, the ones actually designed to carry you toward things, go weak. Your heart does things you can feel from the inside. Your stomach performs interpretations of the situation that nobody asked for. This is fear doing to your body in one concentrated moment what it does in smaller and less noticeable doses to your body every single day when it's held as a habit rather than a crisis. That is the part most people have never considered, the single large fright you recover from. Your body registers the alarm, processes the event, and returns to baseline. The small, repeated daily rehearsal of dread, the low-grade expectation of things going wrong, the quiet certainty that your body is probably doing something it shouldn't be, the anxious habit of checking for evidence that confirms the story you've already decided is true. That doesn't get a recovery period, it just runs. And it runs directly into your physiology. Mulford puts it in terms that should stop you in your tracks. The person who expects to fall ill each winter, who has spoken of their weak chest and their delicate constitution so many times it has become a kind of personal creed, is not predicting their winter. They are constructing it, thought by thought. The way someone who can't stop laying bricks eventually finds themselves standing inside a wall they never meant to build. Here's where this gets uncomfortable, because it should get uncomfortable. A significant portion of what we call just my constitution or just my luck with health or I've always been like this is not genetic inevitability. It is not fate. It is a set of instructions delivered so consistently over so many years that the body has simply done what bodies do with consistent instruction, followed it. That is not a blame. It's the opposite of a blame. Because if the body follows instruction, it follows the new instruction just as surely as it followed the old one. Mulford is clear about this. Healing works by exactly the same law, running in the opposite direction. A body spoken of with confidence, expected to be strong rather than fragile, thought about with something closer to trust than dread, receives a different set of instructions than the body that is dreaded daily. And different instructions delivered with the same consistency produce different results. This is not a promise that thought repairs broken bones or replaces necessary medical treatment. Nobody credible is making that claim. This is something more specific and more verifiable, that the body is always, without exception, building toward the thought held most consistently about it, and that a great deal of what gets called inevitable, constitutional, or just the way I am, is in reality accumulated instruction faithfully followed by a body that never once stopped listening. Now here's the piece that catches most people off guard, because it sounds counterintuitive until it sits for a moment. The thoughts that do the most work on your body are almost never the loud ones. The single dramatic fear, the one that arrives with intensity and keeps you up one night, has less sustained power than the thought so quiet and so repeated that it no longer registers as a thought at all. The sigh at the mirror that has become reflex rather than feeling. The "I'm exhausted" said before there's any real exhaustion to report, just habit. Just the path your mouth takes because it's walked that way so many mornings. The quiet resignation about your energy, your digestion, your sleep, your joints, that has become so familiar it feels like reporting fact rather than creating it. These small thoughts, multiplied by their constancy across days and months and years, carry more actual force in your body than any single dramatic moment of fear or joy or despair. That is worth repeating, because it flips the way most people think about influence. It's not the intensity, it's the constancy. And the good news, which should feel like actual good news once the discomfort of the preceding settles, is that constancy is available to you in the opposite direction. The body that has been slowly built one way by years of one kind of consistent thought can, by that same law, be slowly rebuilt in a different direction by a different kind. Not overnight, not in a week, but by the same patient repetition that built the old thing in the first place, available now to build something else instead. What's being asked of you in this chapter isn't despair over the years of thought already held. It's something much simpler and much more useful. Attention, the willingness to actually listen to what you've been telling your body every day in that quiet undertone that runs beneath the surface of everything else, and to ask honestly whether that undertone is building the body you want to live in. Chapter 3. Fear is an architect of all the thoughts you carry through any given day. None builds faster, none lays more material down with more force, and none does more lasting structural work than fear. And I need to say that plainly right at the start of this chapter because fear has excellent PR. It doesn't usually introduce itself honestly. It shows up wearing much more respectable names: caution, worry, practicality, responsible concern, realistic thinking, being prepared for what might go wrong. Strip away those names one by one, and what you find underneath is almost always the same thing: a thought of some future difficulty or disaster, dwelt upon with enough regularity and enough detail that it has begun by the law we've already established to build itself toward existence. There is one particular flavor of fear worth examining very closely here, because it is the flavor most commonly mistaken for wisdom. It's the kind of fear that rehearses disaster in genuinely fine detail. The failed business, the deteriorating health, the relationship that ends badly, the money that runs out. The mind turns the scenario over and over, examines it from every angle, considers every way it could unfold negatively, and it believes sincerely that it is being protective by doing this. It believes that by imagining the disaster in sufficient detail, it is somehow working to prevent it. What it is actually doing is drawing a blueprint, and a blueprint, once fully drawn and repeatedly revisited, has a way of finding builders. Here's what I want you to picture. You're waiting on something important, a decision about your career, a medical result, a response from someone whose answer matters to you, a financial outcome you've been working toward. Most of your waking hours during this period are given over, not to the other. Things in your life that need attention, but to imagining in detail the way this thing goes wrong. You picture the bad result. You picture delivering the bad news to the people in your life who will be affected. You picture what the aftermath looks like. And you do this not once, but repeatedly, daily, sometimes multiple times per day, at breakfast, at your desk, before you fall asleep. The outcome arrives, or it doesn't, and that part is genuinely outside this chapter's jurisdiction. But here is what is not outside it. The damage to your body and your functioning that occurred during that period of repetitive imagined disaster was real, regardless of how the outcome resolved. Because your nervous system, which you now understand responds to thought as though it were event, went through the catastrophe every single time you rehearsed it. It spent every one of those sessions as though the disaster had already occurred, wearing down its resources over something that, in many cases, never actually happened. That is the first and perhaps most underappreciated cost of fear. The thing you feared may or may not arrive. The biological cost of fearing it, repeated daily, arrives every single time without fail. But Mulford identifies a second cost, and this one is the one that follows directly from everything we've established. The fear dwelt upon does not stay private. It goes out. It does work in the world beyond the mind that holds it. It draws toward its holder with something like the reliability of a physical law, the circumstance it has been rehearsing. Just as the miner who spoke daily of the accident was, with unsettling regularity, the miner to whom the accident came. Now, this is where I want to stop and be really precise about something, because this chapter is easy to misread in a particular direction, and that misreading would cost you something important. This is not an argument against appropriate caution. It is not a suggestion that you ignore warning signs, skip preparation, or walk into real danger without thought. There is a fear that serves you. It is the kind that flashes once, sharp and purposeful, at the sight of actual immediate danger. The instinct that makes you step back from a ledge. The alarm that fires when something is genuinely wrong and needs to be addressed right now. That fear is not only not a problem, it is a gift. Brief, purposeful, and done the moment its work is finished. The fear this chapter is concerned with is a completely different animal. It's not the flash, it's the smolder. Not the single sharp alarm, but the slow burn kept going for weeks and months over a danger that, in most cases, exists primarily in imagination. It's the fire you keep feeding not because the house is actually burning, but because you've developed the habit of tending it, and leaving it unattended makes you more anxious than the tending does. That kind of fear wears the costume of prudence so convincingly that most people never think to question it. The person who cannot sleep for imagining every possible misfortune that could befall a healthy, thriving child genuinely believes they are being a devoted parent rather than a worried one doing quiet damage to themselves and possibly to the child they're worrying over. The person who cannot begin a new project, a new relationship, a new career direction, without first exhausting themselves imagining every way it could fail, genuinely believes they are being careful rather than self-sabotaging before they've even started. The costume is comfortable, and comfortable costumes rarely get removed without deliberate effort. Here is a test Mulford offers, and I find it one of the most practically useful things in the entire book. Ask yourself, when you find yourself in a spiral of worry or fear or anxious rehearsal, does this thought lead toward an action I can actually take today? If the answer is yes, take the action and release the thought. The fear has done its job. It has identified something real that can be addressed, and the address is available. That is the fear that serves you. If the answer is no, if the worry circles and circles over ground that no action available to you today can actually touch, then the thought is no longer functioning as a warning system. It has become a construction site, and the only thing being constructed there is more fear. This distinction, so simple when stated plainly, is one most people have never been shown, because the culture we live in has a complicated relationship with worry. We have been taught, in subtle and not so subtle ways, to equate worry with caring, anxiety with responsibility, the inability to stop thinking about danger with something like moral seriousness. None of that is true, and some of it is actively harmful. Mulford does not promise that eliminating this kind of fear will eliminate misfortune from your life. He makes no such guarantee, and neither would I. What he argues, and what the pattern he observes supports, is that the smoldering fear held daily over imagined futures is not protecting you from those futures. It is, by the law we've established, one of the primary forces that helps build them. What to do with fear, once you recognized it for what it is a question for a later chapter. For now, what matters is the recognition itself, that the thing you've been calling prudence or realism or being prepared has, in its chronic form, been functioning as architecture, building something you didn't consciously choose to build, using your own attention as the material. Chapter 4. The Invisible Climate. Between us, everything we've talked about so far has been about the individual, your body, your fear, your thought, working inside the boundaries of your own life. But here's where Mulford's argument opens up in a direction that most people aren't expecting, and it's the direction that, for many people, lands with the most personal force. Thought does not stay inside you. Every space where two or more people share time, a home, a workplace, a friendship, a family, a relationship of any kind, is also, without anyone having designed it or agreed to it, a climate. Not a metaphorical climate, an actual one, invisible, unmeasured, but felt by everyone who enters it. You already know this. You have always known this, even before you had language for it. You've walked into a room where the atmosphere was so thick with tension, you felt it before you saw a single face. You've entered a home and felt warmth before anyone spoke a word of welcome. You've been in workplaces that felt draining the moment you stepped through the door, and others that felt energizing, and you probably attributed this to lighting or decor or the vibe, which is just the word we use when we can't explain the thing we're clearly feeling. What Mulford argues, and what's worth sitting with very carefully here, is that this climate is made. It is produced by the thought held by the people inside it, not just the thoughts they speak aloud, but the ones they hold in silence, the ones they've been holding for months or years toward each other, the ones they believe are safely private because they've never let them out of their own heads. And it does work on the people inside it, whether those people know it's happening or not. Think about two people raising a child. In one home, a parent thinks about their child primarily through the lens of concern. What's going wrong? What's not developing the way it should? What behaviors are worrying? What failures might be coming? This thought is rarely spoken in those exact terms because the parent is not cruel and would never intend harm. But it is the underlying frequency on which most of the parent's attention to the child is tuned. In another home, a parent sees the same kinds of challenges, the same difficult behaviors, the same developmental uncertainties, because no child is free of these and no good parent is blind to them. But the underlying frequency is different. The default thought toward this child is expectation of what they might become rather than dread of what they might remain. These two children are not being raised in the same weather. Whatever else is equal between them, whatever their individual temperaments, capacities, and choices as they develop, the climate they're growing inside is different. And climate doesn't determine what grows, but it profoundly shapes what has the best conditions for growing. This same principle extends, without any modification at all, into every other relationship you have. The colleague you've quietly decided will never change, will always be difficult, will always be the obstacle in whatever room they walk into. You've never said this to their face, but you carry that thought into every interaction with them. And your thought, by the mechanics already described, is doing something in that space, something they're likely registering without knowing why they always feel a particular way after conversations with you, and why something between you has never quite moved. The friend you've been worried about for years? The family member whose situation you've mentally rehearsed going from bad to worse so many times that you've essentially written the ending before it's arrived. The partner whose particular habit or flaw you've held in steady negative focus for so long that you've become, without intending to, a kind of architect of the pattern you most want to see change. Mulford makes a careful distinction here that I want to make sure doesn't get lost. This is not a claim that other people are entirely shaped by what you think of them. People have their own wills, their own histories, their own agency. This is not about removing responsibility from anyone or making you cosmically responsible for everything that happens in every relationship you touch. It is the narrower and more manageable claim that your thought toward another person is not a private, neutral act. It is something sent. And what is sent consistently over time is not without effect on what's received, which means the question of what you are habitually thinking toward the people closest to you is not a sentimental or spiritual question. It is a practical one with practical consequences, and here is perhaps the hardest part of this chapter to sit with. The thought held most consistently toward the people nearest to us is the thought held in private, not the words spoken over dinner or the kindness offered publicly, the running internal commentary that runs beneath all of that. The ongoing, often unexamined evaluation of who these people are, what they're capable of, where they're heading, and whether any of it is likely to improve. That commentary is the climate, and you're living inside it with them whether you recognize it as something you're generating or not. The practical implication here is not guilt. It is not a reason to feel terrible about every uncharitable thought you've ever had about someone you love. It is a reason to become genuinely curious about what the climate of your closest relationships actually consists of, at the level beneath what's being said, and to ask whether what's being generated there is what you actually want those relationships to be built from, because the building never stops, not in the body, not in the fortune, and not in the space between you and the people who matter most. Chapter 5. The thought you never say out loud. Here is a belief so comfortable and so widely held that it functions almost like a social contract. The thought you keep to yourself doesn't count. You think it, maybe you feel it, but because you don't say it, because you don't act on it, because you never let it leave the interior of your own mind, it evaporates. It leaves no mark. It does no damage and has no real effect on anyone, including yourself. That belief is the one this chapter is going to take apart, carefully and specifically, because it may be the most consequential error in the entire book. Think about what silence actually protects a thought from. When you say something unkind out loud, there is a correction available. Someone might push back. You might hear it land wrong in the air and pull it back yourself. The spoken thought gets tested, refined, sometimes abandoned entirely, because the moment it enters the world, it is subject to response. The thought you keep silent enjoys none of that. It sits in the dark, unchallenged, turning over and over in the same grooves, growing more elaborate and more entrenched with each repetition, precisely because there is no friction available to wear it down. What is never spoken is in this sense not protected by its silence. It is nourished by it. There is something else happening here that Mulford identifies with real precision, and it's about the specific quality of the private thought as distinct from the public one. When you speak, you are at some level performing, not necessarily dishonestly, but the presence of a listener shapes what leaves your mouth. You edit, consciously or not. You moderate. You consider how things will land. This is not a flaw. It is just what social communication is. But in the private thought, where no listener is expected and no judgment is forthcoming, most people think with a quality of honesty that their public speech never quite reaches. The private thought is where the real verdict lives, the real assessment of a situation, a person, yourself, the genuine feeling underneath the managed response. And if thought, as we've established, does real work in the world, then the thought done with full honesty and full privacy, unmoderated by any social awareness, is the thought doing the most work of all. This should stop you, because most of us have never thought about the private hour, the thought before sleep, the internal commentary that runs through an ordinary morning, as particularly powerful. We've thought of it as the unserious version of thought, the rough draft nobody else sees, the noise behind the signal. But the law described in these pages doesn't differentiate between spoken and unspoken. It doesn't give you a discount for keeping it quiet. What is thought in silence is thought in full. It goes out from its holder and does its work exactly as any other thought does, except that it has been given more time, more repetition, more privacy in which to grow, and no external correction to redirect it. Here's a scenario that I think will land very personally for most people reading this. Think of someone you have had a difficult history with, maybe an estrangement, a long-running tension, something that was never fully resolved. You behave reasonably toward them in any public situation. If you're around them, you're courteous. You don't make scenes. You say the right things. To anyone observing, you appear to have made your peace with it. But in the private hour, when you're alone, when the performance is off and the real thought runs unimpeded, the old grievance comes back out. You turn it over. You revisit the details. You remember exactly how it felt, exactly what was wrong, exactly what was never adequately acknowledged. And it's not dulled by familiarity. In some cases, it's sharper, more refined by the years of private rehearsal, each repetition adding another layer of certainty to the story you've been telling yourself. Which of these two, the courteous public behavior or the silent nightly rehearsal, is the thought being sent outward hour upon hour to do its work? The courtesy, however sincere in the moment, is a single act, repeated occasionally when circumstances require it. The silent rehearsal is a habit, consistent, private, unchallenged, running on a frequency that no social occasion interrupts. It is the habit, not the act, that carries the power. This has a direct implication for something many people believe is a mark of good character, the practice of keeping unkind thoughts to oneself rather than speaking them. The idea that if you don't say the uncharitable thing, you've done the right thing. Mulford would agree with you, partially. Speaking the unkind thought into a relationship does damage. Not speaking, it is better for the relationship in that immediate moment. But not speaking it is not the same as not sending it. The unspoken judgment is still delivered by the way you hold yourself in someone's presence. By the slight shift in tone they pick up without being able to explain why. By the climate you generate toward them in the invisible medium that Mulford argues moves between people as surely as warmth moves from one body to another in a cold room. And in the private hours, when even those subtle behavioral signals aren't operating, the thought runs full and unrestricted, doing whatever it does in the dark by the law that doesn't require your belief or your attention to keep operating. Here's where the relief comes in, and I want to make sure this doesn't get buried under the weight of everything preceding it. If the silent thought of grievance carries that much force, the reverse is equally true. The silent thought of goodwill held toward a person who will never know you held it has the same reach and the same power as the silent grievance, operating in the opposite direction. The quiet, private thought of genuine hope for someone who is struggling, the real internal shift from judgment to something approaching understanding, not performed for anyone, not said aloud, just actually held in the honest private space where your real thoughts live. That is not wasted for going unspoken. It does its work. In the same way, through the same invisible medium, but pushing in a different direction. The discipline being uncovered here is not about policing your speech. It is about something far more interior and far more consequential. It's about what is actually happening in the unobserved hours, in the real thought, the one that runs when no one is watching, including sometimes yourself. That is where the actual building is done, and that is where the most meaningful version of this work lives. Chapter 6. The Path, Worn into the Ground. A habit of thought is not something that appeared one day, fully formed, as a result of a single decision you made. It grew the way a path grows through a field with no proper road, not by one person walking once with intention, by hundreds of ordinary, unconsidered crossings, each one pressing the grass down slightly further, each one making the next crossing fractionally easier, until eventually the ground itself seems to insist that this is the only way through. The path looks natural because it's old, but it was made, step by step, by repetition. This is exactly how a thought habit forms, and understanding this precisely is the beginning of actually being able to do something about it, rather than just feeling vaguely guilty about thoughts you don't know how to change. If you have spent years, even decades, running a particular thought about yourself, about what you're capable of, about what tends to happen to you, about how people see you, about whether things generally work out, that thought does not feel like an opinion anymore. It feels like a fact. It feels like observation. It feels like simple, honest realism. It is a path, worn smooth and deep by repetition. And the smoothness of the path is what makes it feel inevitable. The most important thing Mulford says about change, buried in this chapter, is the thing most people skip past in their rush to get to the practical technique. He says, the old thought does not vanish simply because you have decided a new one is better. This sounds obvious, and yet almost every approach to changing habitual thought ignores it completely. Most approaches treat the decision to think differently as though it were the change itself. As though the moment you resolve to be more positive, more confident, more expectant of good outcomes, the old pattern steps aside to make room. It does not step aside. It comes back, often exactly when you least want it, with all the ease and familiarity of a path your feet have walked 10,000 times. The morning you wake up, and despite yesterday's resolution, the old dread is right there, waiting. The moment something goes slightly wrong, and the old story about what this means about you, about your prospects, about what always happens, clicks back into place like it never left. And most people, when this happens, do one of two things. They decide the new thinking doesn't work, or they decide they don't have the strength to maintain it, and they drift back to the familiar path. What Mulford asks instead, and what changes everything about how you approach this, is to understand the return of the old thought not as failure, but as information. It means the old path is still there. That's all. It doesn't mean the new path isn't being built. It means the new path hasn't been walked enough times yet to become the easier one. And since paths are made entirely by repetition, the only relevant question is, are you walking the new one? Here is what that actually looks like in practice, because philosophy without practice is just interesting wallpaper. The first work, the work that comes before any technique, is noticing, not changing, not suppressing, not replacing, just noticing the thought in the act of forming. Catching yourself already 2 steps down the familiar path before the noticing arrives. Getting better gradually at catching it earlier, recognizing the thought as thought rather than as fact. This sounds passive. It is not. This noticing is, in Mulford's framework and in much of what modern attention training has since confirmed, the foundational act from which every other change becomes possible. You cannot redirect a path you haven't noticed you're walking. Once the noticing has become somewhat reliable, something very specific can happen next. And here is where Mulford's approach diverges sharply from the version of this idea that has been popularized in ways that mostly don't work. He does not ask you to leap from fear to triumph. He does not suggest that you replace the thought of dread with a thought of glorious, confident certainty. That leap is real, but it's too far for the mind to make in a single step. The mind will reject a thought it cannot honestly hold, and a thought the mind silently rejects, however loudly you say it to yourself, does precisely nothing. What he asks for instead is a nearer thought, one that is honest, one that the mind can actually be persuaded to occupy. Here's what that looks like. You wake up and the familiar morning dread starts. The accounting of everything that might go wrong today, everything that's uncertain, everything that's not yet resolved. That's the old path, the faraway replacement, the thought that today is going to be wonderful and everything will work out perfectly, is so far from where your mind actually is that it won't hold. The nearer thought is not that. The nearer thought is, I don't actually know yet how today is going to go. And not knowing means there is room for something other than what I've been rehearsing. That's a smaller thought. It is not inspiring in the traditional motivational sense, but it is a thought the mind can actually walk. And a smaller thought, walked every morning, is immeasurably more powerful than a grand thought walked never. The words used in this work matter more than most people realize, not because of anything mystical about language, but because words are one of the primary tools by which thought is shaped, even and especially in private. A person who repeats, quietly and without ceremony, a phrase that runs against the old habit is doing something more than self-soothing. They are walking the new path, one repetition at a time, building through exactly the same mechanism that built the old path, patient, unspectacular repetition. This is not exciting. It was never going to be exciting. The truth about how lasting change in thought actually works is much less dramatic and much more durable than any single moment of transformation. The old path was not built in a day. The new one won't be either. But the old path was built with no special power, no exceptional capacity, no gift unavailable to you. It was built with repetition alone. And repetition is something you have in identical supply, available to build something else instead. One more thing deserves to be said here, because it's the error that causes the most well-intentioned efforts to collapse. Redirecting thought is not the same as suppressing it. If you notice the old dread and respond by forcing it into silence, by commanding it to stop without offering the mind anything else to do with that space, you have not redirected it. You have pressurized it, and a thought driven underground without a substitute tends to surface later with more force than before, having had time to build pressure in the dark. The work is not silencing. It is substitution. Patient, repeated, unglamorous substitution until the new path is worn smooth enough that it starts to feel like the natural way through, which is exactly how the old path felt once, before you started walking a different one. Chapter 7. The Thought Beneath the Work. There is no subject on which the argument of this book meets more immediate resistance than the subject of money. The resistance is understandable. Money looks, on its surface, like it is governed entirely by external forces, markets, opportunity, timing, circumstance, the economy, luck, things that operate completely outside any individual mind and make it seem almost naive to suggest that what a person habitually thinks has any real bearing on what they accumulate. And yet, when Mulford looked closely at the actual pattern of who builds prosperity over time and who doesn't, what he found was not the story most people tell themselves about why some people have money and others don't. It was something more interior, more uncomfortable, and more actionable. Here is the pattern. Think about the thought most commonly held about money by people who perpetually struggle to accumulate it. The most honest version of that thought, not the one they'd say publicly, but the one that runs in private, the one that operates beneath every financial decision they make. It is not simple desire. Everyone who wants more money desires more money. Desire is universal and proves nothing. The thought that actually governs the relationship most struggling people have with money is dread, a low, constant, almost background frequency expectation of insufficiency, a habit of engaging with money primarily through the lens of scarcity. What's running out? What won't be enough? What always seems to slip away just when it feels within reach? What the next bill is going to cost? What the account will show when they look. This is not a moral failure. It is not laziness or irresponsibility. It is a thought habit, worn smooth by years of repetition, that has become the underlying frequency on which this person's entire relationship with money operates. And by the law we've established, that frequency is actively doing something. It is not neutral. It is not just describing a financial reality. It is participating in generating it. Now look at the thought held by people who seem to accumulate prosperity with what looks from the outside like ease, sometimes without any obvious advantage of circumstance or birth. It is not, when you examine it honestly, a thought of money as owed to them. It is not arrogance or unearned confidence. It is something far quieter and far more consistent. A working expectation. An assumption carried through the ordinary hours of ordinary effort that work honestly applied tends to find its return. That opportunity exists in the world and is not fundamentally hostile to their presence in it. That things, while not guaranteed, generally add up over time. This expectation does for the prosperous mind what the miner's confidence did for the miner underground. It is not a guarantee against misfortune on any given day, but it is a steady current running beneath the visible effort, and the same visible effort, channeled through that current rather than against it, does not produce identical results. Here's the objection I'm anticipating because it's the fair one. Hard work And genuine skill and circumstance obviously matter enormously. They do. Nobody credible is arguing otherwise. A thought of prosperity doesn't build a business without the actual labor, judgment, and knowledge the business requires. But here is the equally true thing that goes unsaid. The thought beneath the work shapes the work itself. The person who labors under a settled expectation of scarcity works differently than the person who labors under a settled expectation of return. Not necessarily harder or less hard. Differently, more fearfully, more prone to abandoning the venture at the first real difficulty, because the difficulty confirms what they already believed rather than simply testing what they hoped. More likely to accept a lesser outcome than to hold for the better one they could have had with a different underlying expectation. More likely to undersell, underask, underestimate what their effort is worth in the world. The same labor, performed by two different people under two different habitual thoughts, is not in practice the same labor. There is an error in how most people interpret this idea, and it's worth addressing directly, because it's the error that makes people dismiss the whole thing as wishful thinking. The error is confusing a single intense moment of hope or affirmation with the thing Mulford is actually describing. The single fervent wish made before a big moment, the dramatic resolution, the brief peak of confidence before an important meeting, quickly dissolved back into the habitual undercurrent the moment ordinary life resumes. This is not the thing. This is not the current. This is a temporary interruption of the current that was already running, and it does approximately nothing to change the underlying frequency. What the law requires is constancy, not intensity. The quiet, almost unnoticed working expectation carried through the unremarkable hours of an unremarkable week. Not the one dramatic moment of belief. The settled background assumption about whether effort finds return, whether the world is basically hospitable to what you're trying to build. That assumption is the climate in which your work either grows or doesn't. And like the climate in which plants grow, it doesn't override the work required, but it shapes, profoundly and persistently, what the same work produces. The practical implication, the place where this becomes something you can actually do rather than just an interesting idea about other people, follows the same shape as everything else in this book. Not a dramatic leap into a thought you can't honestly hold. Not an affirmation that rings false the moment you say it, but a patient, persistent redirection of the habitual undercurrent away from the reflexive rehearsal of scarcity and toward the quieter, more honest, more available thought that effort applied with genuine honesty does, on the whole and over time, tend to find something real. That is the thought most people can actually hold. And held consistently over ordinary time, it begins to do different work than the thought it replaced. Chapter 8, The Hand That Never Stopped Moving. We've come a long way from where we started, and I want to bring everything together here in a way that is genuinely useful rather than just conclusive. Let me remind you of what we established at the very beginning, and let it land with the full weight of everything that came after it. The building has never stopped, not for a single hour, not during the years when you weren't thinking about any of this, not during the days when you were running entirely on automatic, living inside habits of thought you had never once examined. Not right now, as you read these final words. Every person mentioned across these chapters, the confident person and the fearful one, the person thinking their body toward strength or toward fragility, the person whose thought climate nourishes the people around them or quietly erodes them, the person running a current of sufficiency or scarcity beneath all the visible effort of their daily life. Every one of them was building at every waking moment, whether or not they ever suspected a trowel was in their hand. And so were you. So were you. I'm not saying this to produce guilt. Guilt is useless here, and Mulford knew it, which is why his book contains none of it. What he understood is that guilt over past building is just more construction material added to the wrong wall. It doesn't help. It doesn't undo anything. It only adds weight. What he asks for instead is something far more valuable and far more rare. Attention, not performance, not dramatic transformation, not the overnight shift from one kind of person into another, just the willingness to actually notice what has been happening beneath the surface of your life, in the thought that runs before you're quite awake, in the private accounting that happens in the silent hour before sleep, in the habitual frequency you've been broadcasting toward your body and your circumstances and the people closest to you, and to ask honestly whether what you find there is what you would have chosen to build if you'd known you were building. Here's the thing about attention that most approaches to personal development get exactly backwards. They treat attention as a prerequisite for change, as though the right question is, what do you want to be different? And then attention is deployed in service of that goal. But Mulford's insight, and what the full weight of these chapters points toward, is that attention itself is the change, not a step toward it, not a preparation for it, the actual thing. Because a thought noticed is a thought no longer running automatically. A path seen is a path that can be departed from. A habit that has been brought into conscious awareness even once is no longer quite as invisible or quite as automatic as it was before that moment of noticing. This is not the whole work. It is the beginning of the whole work, which is enough for a final chapter to be asking. You do not need to have transformed your thinking by the time you finish reading. You do not need to have resolved the old dread, rebuilt the habitual frequency, changed the climate of every relationship, or unlocked some dramatically different relationship with money and health and fortune. What you need is simpler than any of that and harder than it sounds. You need to look at the trowel. That's all. Just look at it. Just acknowledge that it has been there in your hand since before you knew what it was. That it has been moving across the wall of your life, laying material down, taking instruction from the thought running beneath everything else. That this has been happening not because of some failure of character or some exceptional susceptibility to difficulty, but because this is what thought does in every person, without exception, without pause. The only question that changes anything is what happens next. Not in some other chapter or some future version of your life where the conditions are better or the obstacles are cleared. In the next ordinary thought about to be thought. In the next private moment when the habitual path appears underfoot and no one is watching to see which way you go. Mulford ended his book without a resolution, because a resolution would have been dishonest. He ended with a question he put into the reader's hands and left there. I'll do the same. You know now that you've been building. You know what some of that building has been made of. You have seen, with more clarity than you probably had before, what the material of thought actually does over time. In the body, in the fortune, in the space between you and the people who matter most. The trowel is still in your hand. What happens in the next thought is entirely, completely, and now consciously yours.